I want to begin by talking about Wilfred Cantwell Smith. How many of you have heard of Wilfred Cantwell Smith? That's good. So he was a Canadian. He was a Christian lay minister, and he was also a comparative religion, a scholar of comparative religion. In fact, he was one of the earliest scholars of comparative religion. He taught at McGill University. And I got onto him through Karen Armstrong. So Karen Armstrong, some of you may have read her autobiography. There's a book called The Spiral Staircase. How many of you have read that? Oh, my goodness. Well, that is well worth reading, The Spiral Staircase, about her time as a failed nun, Christian nun, and how that really didn't work for her. But in the midst of a crisis, she came across this book by Wilfred Cantwell Smith called Faith and Belief, the difference between them. And that's why I'm going to begin my talk, because I'm going to say a few words about what he says in that book. But I'll say a little bit more about him before I say what he says in the book, because he was a very interesting character. As I say, he taught at McGill University, and he specialised in Islam. He was one of the earliest Western scholars to look at Islam. And when students wanted to study with him, he would interview them, and he would say, well, look, we're going to do a whole term, or semester, as they say out there, a whole semester on Islam. And when we do that, you have to practice Islam for the whole of the term, because you cannot understand religion from the outside. All religions look silly from the outside. You can only understand it from being it, by actually doing it. So he got them to agree to practice Islam for the whole term, so that they would understand it more than just intellectually. So he's a very interesting man. So this book, Faith and Belief, the difference between them, is in a very important book, in my opinion, but also in many other people's opinion too. And in that book, he traces the degeneration of the word belief from early times to contemporary times. It's a very interesting history of how the word belief changed. And of course, the word belief is a translation of the Latin credo. So now here's an interesting thing. Our word is Shraddha, isn't it? Or Saddha in Pali, Shraddha in Sanskrit is what we translate as faith. And we say, well, where does that word come from? It comes from the root da, Shraddha, da, which means to place the heart upon. You've probably heard that. Well, do you know, credo comes from exactly the same root, da, to place the heart upon. So Shraddha and credo are actually very, very connected words. And I find that very interesting, because very often Buddhist teachers that I've heard, order members, they like to say that faith in Buddhism is always different from faith in Christianity. It's a completely different thing. I don't think it is that different, actually. So anyway, Wilfred Cantwell Smith. What he says is credo, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, meant faith. It did not mean belief. So there's a difference between the word faith and the word belief. For instance, in the Pali Canon, the ancient works of Buddhism, faith is often defined by what you have faith in other words, what you believe in. So what's faith? Faith is having confidence in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and Pratitya Samutpada, or conditioned co-production. So it's very much faith is what you have your faith in. In other words, you believe the Buddha's teachings. And similarly nowadays in Christianity, you've got the articles of faith. That's what the credo is. It's the articles of faith. And they're kind of ideas, conceptualizations of a faith which you have to assent to. That's what belief really means these days. But it didn't used to mean that. And one of the things he says is, we'll take the credo from Bach's Mass in B minor. Do you know the Bach's Mass in B minor? There's this, one of the movements is the credo. Well, Bach isn't saying he believes in this, this and this in that work. It's an outpouring of love for Christianity or for Christ. It's a strong emotional commitment. It's not about belief in. I was going to say something else there, but I've forgotten what it was. But I'll say a little bit about Bach now, because Bach, his whole life was given over to Christianity, and all his works, even the so-called secular works like the concertos and so on, they were expressions of his faith, his credo in God, Christ, and so on. So they're, highly imaginative works of art, tremendous works of art, and they were just an outpouring of his faith. And what happened over the years is the idea of credo being a kind of heartfelt commitment became an intellectual assent in certain ideas, and that was a degeneration of the word. So oh yes, that's right, that was the other thing, belief. The word belief is a very interesting word, in fact. Where does it come from? It comes from leaf, L-I-E-F. And where does leaf come from? Leaf is connected with the German word Liebe, and I expect you know what Liebe means. Liebe means love. So in the olden days, belief did not mean what it means now. It meant to beloved. It was the beloved. You loved something. That's what you believe in. And I remember, those of you who are old enough might know this song. A song by Neil Young, I Believe in You. Anybody know that song? Yeah. I believe in you. Yeah, remember? Those are the days, weren't they? Yeah. What he's saying in that song is, I love you. Yeah, I believe in you. So to love or to believe in the old days meant to love. Yeah. So that's important, and it's important for us Buddhists as well, because I think very often when we think of faith, we think about what we have faith in, what it's directed to. Awakening, the Buddha, the teachings and so on. But actually it's very interesting to think about faith not in terms of what it's pointed to, but faith as a mental state. So moving on from Wilfred Cantwell Smith now, I've said enough about him, although I hope you do look him up, because he's well worth reading. It's really, really tremendous. I often refer to him as Wilfred Cantwell Smith the Great, because he's such a great character. Really good thinker, and But actually, let's go back to him now that I've gone back to him already. In his book, there's a chapter on Christianity, a chapter on Islam, a chapter on Hinduism, and a chapter on Buddhism. And he's pretty good on Buddhism. He knew his Buddhism. He's been dead for a while now. But one of the things that really surprised me in the chapter on Buddhism is he immediately says that the Buddha was a man of faith. And I thought, no, that's wrong. He was a man of wisdom. He didn't have faith, he had wisdom. But now, after reading the book, I realised that he was right, or at least he had a very good point. Because his understanding of faith, again, was very exalted. He didn't actually define faith in the book. He said, I'm not going to define faith. But in a way he did. There's one point in the book where he says that faith is made up of two elements: insight and response. Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? Faith is made up of, first of all, insight. Now, anyone who's taught a lot of beginners classes, Dharma classes, will see this. Well, they'll understand this very well, because what happens in a beginner's class on Buddhism, if they're completely new to Buddhism, you just tell them some of the basic stuff. And you can see them, and they express this too. They're having insights, one after another. They go, oh wow, of course, yeah. Or, oh, I always felt that somehow, but you've expressed it, you've articulated it for me. all the way through the course, people having these insights, really important insights. So that's an important part of faith, that when you have faith in something, there's some kind of insight there, there's some kind of understanding involved in that. It's not just this whole idea of blind belief. This is another thing that Buddhists tend to throw onto Christians, isn't it? Oh, we don't have blind belief here. Well, we have at least partially sighted faith. It has to be partially sighted, otherwise you'd be enlightened. And insight and response. Now, the response is important. The response is yes. Yeah. It's a saying yes to the insight. Now, this is another interesting thing about beginners' classes. People are having great insights all over the place. Course ends and most of them don't come back again. You never see them again. Where have they gone? Well, we don't know. We don't know why they didn't come back. Maybe they found a better Buddhist movement to get involved in, but probably they didn't. Probably what happened is they had the insight, then they didn't have the response, which was a yes. The response is a positive response, and it's a yes to that insight, meaning, yes, I believe that to be true, or I've seen that is true, and now I'm going to try to live my life in the light of that insight. And often what happens is I think in beginners' classes people have the insight, but they can't always follow through because life is, as you know, complicated and busy, and there's a lot to do and lots of pressures on people, so they can't always follow through with the insight. But I think that's quite an interesting way of understanding faith, isn't it? That it's insight and positive response. And of course you see this in the Pali Canon when the Buddha teaches someone, but I'll talk about that in a little bit later. So, faith as a mental state rather than the object of faith. So let's look at faith as a mental state. In fact, the early Abhidharmists understood this. So, you know, the early Pali Canon, you got the Trikaya, the three so-called baskets, or the three kind of sections. And there's the Sutta Pitaka, not the Trikaya, the Tripitaka it is, the Tripitaka. You've got the Sutta Pitaka, which is all the teachings of the Buddha where he's talking to people. And then you've got the Vinaya Pitaka, which is the rules that the monks had to live by and the stories behind each rule. And then you've got the Abhidharma Pitaka, which is the systematization of the Buddha's teaching, written down and systematized probably by monks sometime after the death of the Buddha, and they systematized it and put it all in lists and so on. And so in the Abhidharma you get lists of mental states. I think you get 52 mental states altogether, and some of them are neutral mental states, and a lot of them are unskillful mental states, a lot of those, but you get 11 positive mental states or skillful states. And the Abhidharmists, what they said was faith is present in every one of the positive mental states. Now that's a very interesting thing to say. Faith is present in every positive mental state or skillful mental state. So when you feel compassion towards someone, faith is present. When you feel metta towards people, faith is present. When you're being really mindful, faith is present. Now that's a really interesting idea, isn't it? Now, I don't think that when the Abhidharmists said that, they weren't saying that only Buddhists had got into positive mental states. In other words, they weren't saying that faith was particularly connected with the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path or whatever. So faith is not, for the Abhidharmists, connected with those things. It's part of a positive mental state. So what could that mean? Why is faith present in every positive mental state? How does that work? How is faith present in compassion? How is it present in the sense of shame, which is another positive mental state? Well, you could say that faith is the openness to what is. Or you could say it's the desire to understand, the desire to really see. Or you could say it's the the expansion of the self outwards. So compassion is very much that, isn't it? When you feel compassion towards someone, your own self-reference is expanded to include another person within it. And when compassion is developed to its utmost, you feel as much for that person's suffering as you do for yourself. So all positive mental states are overcoming of the self. They're going outwards from the self. They're outward going. So faith is like that. Faith is an outward goingness. So far we've looked at Wilfred Cantwell Smith, faith and belief, the difference between them. We've had a quick look at the Abhidharma and faith in every positive mental state. So now I want to go to 1981 in Tuscany. I was in Tuscany for 3 months in 1981. How lucky was that? I was living in a convent. Well, what used to be a convent, no longer a convent. It was a place run by someone who used to put on operas in the summertime. It was in a little place called, just outside a village called Battignano. And that was the venue of the first ever 3-month ordination retreat for men. And I was on the team. There were 4 of us on the team: Subhuti, Vasantra, Stirumati and myself. And Sangrakshna Bhante was there. And we were there for 3 months. It was a marvellous, wonderful time. And in the course of that 3 months, Bhante Sangrakshna led many question answers and study seminars and so on. And it was really very rich. He gave himself completely. And in the course of that time, he began to talk about faith in Mahayana Buddhism. And he was saying that when you look at Mahayana sutras, the faith is expressed very imaginatively. And we'll hear about that a bit later, I think. I think we'll have time. Faith is expressed very imaginatively. And in a way, he said, you could say that in Mahayana, faith is the imagination. Faith is the imagination. So then the question arises, what did he mean by the imagination? Well, what he said about it was that you could say that the imagination is a faculty, or it becomes a faculty. And it becomes a faculty, it's not always present, but it becomes a faculty when you begin to become integrated. Hence, integration. Hence, the mindfulness of breathing is very important. In order to do anything, in order to practice the spiritual life, we need to gather ourselves together. We need to become integrated. And he spoke specifically at that time in terms of reason and emotion becoming integrated. Because you know what we're like, human beings. Our reason and emotion aren't always talking to each other. So you get the well-known experience of, you should do something, and that's the best thing to do for everyone, but you go and do something else. Yeah. So you should do something. The reason's telling you this is the best thing to do, but your emotion goes and makes you do something else. You know that situation? It's quite common, isn't it? So that's one of the problems of living a spiritual life that we have to overcome. We know what we should do, but it's very hard for us to do it. So often, I lead meditation courses at the Buddhist Centre, and what I say right at the beginning, let me just, hold on. It's not working very well. I say, look, you've got to practice in between times, because if you don't meditate, nothing happens. You've got to meditate. Okay, we'll meditate every day. And then they come back, no, they haven't. And then, often they say, I don't understand why I don't do it, because when I do it, I know I get a lot out of it, but I just don't understand why I don't do it. I don't understand either, but I'm pretty much the same. We're all the same, aren't we? We know the best thing to do for ourselves and other people, but often we don't do that. So there's a kind of split, well, that's one way of looking at it anyway, between our reason and our emotion. And when we become integrated, those kind of integrate together, they meet. And when they meet together, what happens is when your reason and emotion are integrated, they kind of rise. They don't just stay on the same level, they rise to a higher level and they become the imagination. So reason and emotion, fully integrated, become the awakened imagination. And the awakened imagination is the faculty which sees things as they really are. That's the way Bhante spoke about faith in the imagination in 1981 in Tuscany, and he said a lot more since. But that's all I'm going to say about that. Now, when Bhante talks about the imagination, he often refers back to the English romantic poets, people like Coleridge and Shelley and so on, and because they were very much into the imagination, he refers back to them. But I think I found, in the Pali Canon, I found a Buddhist example of the imagination in the way that Bhante speaks about it. And in fact, you get it quite a lot in the Pali Canon. You get what's called a graduated discourse. Has anybody read my book, Great Faith, Great Wisdom? Brilliant, that's good. Only one person. It's not good. It's really not good. But it's good from the point of view of what I'm going to say, because you haven't already read it, so it'll be new to you. So it's good from that point of view. And maybe you'll buy the book afterwards. But anyway, in the graduated discourse is something that the Buddha did often when he met someone for the first time, someone he'd never met before, someone who wasn't already a disciple of his. So he'd meet someone and he'd start talking to them. And probably they'd begin by just, exchanging pleasantries. But then the Buddha would begin to talk about the Dharma, but the kind of lower reaches, as it were, of the Dharma. He'd talk about renunciation and the benefits of renunciation. And then he would talk about generosity and the benefits of generosity. And he would talk about ethics and the gods. Because, if you're ethical, when you die, you'll be reborn in the God realm. So he talked about all that, which is what I think of as the lower reaches of the Dharma. What I mean by that is, up until now, while he's just talking about those things, he hasn't given them the full Dharma, because the things that I've just mentioned are common to all religions, aren't they? Generosity, renunciation and ethics and all that. That's common to all religions. It's not particularly Buddhist. But he would talk about that for a while. And then, if he saw that that person's mind was ready, he would give them the full Dharma. He would give them a wisdom teaching. Maybe he'd talk about the Four Noble Truths or the Three Lakshanas or whatever. Yeah. So that's what I'm going to talk about, the mind that is ready to receive wisdom, because the texts are quite explicit about what that mind is made up of, and it's made up of four things. So first of all, the mind that is ready is kalla-citta. Kalla-citta, and I'll write this down. So citta, you probably know already. Citta means mind, but it also means heart. They didn't have this distinction between the mind and the heart in ancient India, so they don't have this thing of mind and heart business. Mind-heart, you could say, or heart-mind. You could say that citta is your interiority. It's your inner life. It's your disposition. Yeah? And kalla means ready or prepared. How many of you know kalla-citta? You ought to remember kalla-citta. That's the Sanskrit version of kalla-citta, is kalla-citta. So she is a mind prepared. A mind prepared for what? A mind prepared to receive the Buddha's teaching. A mind prepared for wisdom. A mind prepared for insight. Yeah? So what the Buddha was doing up until this point, he was getting that person ready to gain insight, to really understand, to see. And then the text tells you what that mind is made up of, and it's made up of four things. So the first thing is mudu. It's mudu-citta. Mudu-citta. Mudu is a brilliant word. It's one of the best Pali words in my opinion. And I've been saying for years that a preceptor should call someone mudu. And it still hasn't happened, but I was in Essen, Germany, about a month ago, and to my delight, I met an order member called Mudu-ka. I was utterly delighted to at last meet someone who's got the word mudu, the word mudu in their name. So mudu is a lovely word. It means soft, tender, yeah, and therefore pliable, flexible, workable, yeah. So if you've read any of the Pali Canon, you will have come across this word. It's often translated as pliable. So it's a mind that's soft and tender, therefore workable. You could say it's the opposite of a hard mind. A hard mind is a mind that's not prepared to take anything in. So things just bounce off you. You know, you're trying to tell something and they're just not listening. Bounce, it comes off them, and you know they haven't taken it in. We, you know what we like. We do that, don't we? But the mudu-citta is a mind that's soft and tender and pliable and workable and flexible enough to really take in what the Buddha's saying. I often think of the wax seal of an emperor. You know, they write a letter and then they have the hot wax goes on to the letter, and then there's a seal that goes on. And the seal takes the impress, yeah, of the stamp, because it's soft. So it's a bit like the mind. In order to take the impress of the Dharma, the mind needs to be soft enough to really receive. You could say that mudu-citta means a receptive mind, a mind that's receiving, able to receive new ideas, ideas which are new to you, which you don't know yet, and which will change your life. So that's what mudu-citta is. Next one is ninīvaraṇā. It's a long word. There's a misprint in the book. It says vinīvaraṇā, which we'll have to change if there's ever a second edition. Ninīvaraṇā. Nirvana, does that ring any bells to you? Nirvana? The Pancha Nirvana. Pancha means 5. The 5 hindrances. So Nirvana means hindrance. And some translators of the text, when they come across here, they say it's ninīvaraṇā-citta. So what some translators have is a mind free of the 5 hindrances. Yeah. What are the 5 hindrances? Well, the 5 hindrances, they particularly hinder you from entering into jhana. They hinder that. So what this suggests is there's no hindrances. Therefore, the Buddha has managed to get this person into jhana, or at least access concentration. However, nirvana doesn't only mean hindrance, it also means obstruction. And ni is no. Yeah? So no obstruction. So it's a mind unobstructed. You're not obstructing the truth from coming in. It could simply mean that. It's rather like mudu. But it's another aspect of that, which is you're not putting a wall up, obstructing the truth from coming in. So it could mean that, no obstruction. Or it could mean that the 5 hindrances aren't present. Well, that's an interesting idea, that the Buddha has spoken to this person, they become very soft and tender, their heart is very tender. And now the 5 hindrances aren't present, which means they aren't in a negative state. And they've gone into a higher mental state on listening to the Buddha and conversing with him. So that's, that could well be the case. And that goes along with the next one, and you'll know the next one. Udagga-citta. What does udagga mean?
Lofty.
Lofty. Tall. Yeah. So here it means exalted, elated, exultant. Yeah. Delighted, uplifted, inspired. That's what it means. So that follows on very nicely. If this word does mean the 5 hindrances aren't present, well, of course, you're going to be exalted. your mind is going to be elated because you're in jhana. You're more or less in the first jhana at least. So your mind is now inspired and elated and lifted up. So that's what the Buddha's managed to do in talking to this person. And then the final one is... So pasanna is a lovely word as well. Pasanna is a very wide-ranging word. Similar, in fact, it's very, very similar to the word pasada or prasada in Sanskrit. And in Sanskrit, actually, this is prasanna. So it means a lot of things. Let me think, where should we begin? It means calm and serene. So although the person now is uplifted, they're not kind of excited uplifted. They're uplifted, they're inspired, they're delighted, but they're not overexcited. They're still very calm and serene. It means happy, but not in an up-excited kind of happiness. It's or it can mean pleased. It can mean pleased, and it's the happiness that comes from a good life. It's the happiness that comes from being ethical. Yeah? The kind of happiness that hopefully you all experience to a certain degree because you're all practicing ethics, and that does make you a happier kind of person. And it's interesting it's here because the Buddha didn't always manage to get his listener into the kalla-citta. He didn't always manage that because people are different from each other, aren't they? And sometimes he didn't. And there's a famous example where he didn't, which is when the king Ajatasattu. Do you know the famous story of the king Ajatasattu, who was, it was a full moon night, and he was sitting on the roof of his palace with some of his ministers, having a bit of a nice time. And he said, I feel like going to see a holy man. Where's a holy man around here? And they mentioned a few, and then his physician, what's his name? Jivaka. Jivaka said, well, there's the Buddha in the forest over there. The Buddha, let's go and see the Buddha. So they all mounted up on their elephants and horses. The whole royal household went off into the middle of the night over to the forest, and they had to dismount. So it's the famous story where they dismount and then they have to go off in foot, and it's really, really quiet. And apparently there's 2,500 monks there with the Buddha, and it's really quiet. And Ajatasattu says to Jivaka, it's really quiet. 2,000 monks here. Yeah. Are you leading me into a trap? And he was very suspicious. And you'll find out in a minute why he was suspicious. But anyway, they found the Buddha. And the Buddha gave him this great long teaching, great long graduated discourse called the Samanya-pala Sutta, one of the most famous of the Buddha's discourses. And at the end of it, the king said, thank you very much, sir. It's time for me to go. So off he went. And then the Buddha said to the monks that were left behind, he said, if Ajatasattu had not killed his father, Bimbisara, he would have gained insight on listening to this teaching. But because he killed his father, the Buddha actually said this, he was blocked from the transcendental. He was effectively blocked from any spiritual progress because of that. So, here you've got this sense of pasanna, this happiness, which only arises if you have been ethical. So, pasanna also means clear and bright and pure, and it also means devoted. So we have to remember that the Buddha's been talking to this person for probably quite a long time, and the person's having a really great time. They've got into jhana, they're really inspired, so they're having a really great time. So now they've got some faith in the Buddha. They've actually got some faith in this man. He's got something important to tell me. So now they're wide open. Yeah. So I think that those four qualities that make up the kalla-citta, you could say, are the qualities of the awakened imagination. The mind, the heart, is soft, tender, pliable, malleable, workable, flexible. It's elated. exalted, exultant, inspired, free of any negative mental states whatsoever. Udagga, lofty. And pasanna, faithful, happy, pure, clear. That's what the imagination is. That's what the awakened imagination is. And now they are ready to receive the Dharma. So that's what the Buddha does. The Buddha then gives whoever he's talking to a Dharma teaching. It could be he talks about the 3 lakshanas. All conditioned things are impermanent. All conditioned things are unsatisfactory. All things whatsoever are insubstantial. Could be that he talks about the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path or conditioned co-production, but he gives it to them. And they receive it. And it's put very imaginatively, actually, in these texts. What he said, the text tells you that as the Buddha taught this person the Dharma, their mind was like a pure white cloth, ready to receive the dye. And the dye is the Dharma. Such an imaginative way of talking about insight, isn't it? That the mind is now pure and clear and ready, and then colour is poured in. The colour of the Dharma is poured in onto that pure white cloth, and it takes the dye because it's completely pure white. And the Dharma eye opens within them. Then what happens is they've had insight, and then they go for refuge. And they say, I want to go for refuge to you, your Dharma, and your Sangha for the rest of my life. That's what I want to do for the rest of my life. So here, if we come back to Wilfred Cantwell Smith, faith is insight and response. So they've had the insight, now comes the response. I want to go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha for the rest of my life. That's the saying yes to the insight. Okay, so how many of you have seen the film Arrival? Great film, isn't it? So I'll just tell you a little bit about it. It's a sci-fi movie, but it's not a Star Wars type of sci-fi movie. It's much more intelligent. And it's about these beings from outer space who come. They're called heptapods because they have 9, is it 9 or 7? 7, is it? 7 limbs. And they're trying to communicate to us. And they've got a completely different language, of course. So how do you communicate? So you get these linguists from the university are hauled in to try and communicate to these beings. And anyway, to cut a long story short, what happens is that the woman who's the main woman, the linguist who's trying to communicate with these beings, realises that... I'll tell you how she realises it. They're speaking. There's completely unintelligible sounds coming out of them, and she's speaking. They can't understand each other. So she gets a little whiteboard and she puts her name on, Sarah, I think it is. Sarah, me. And they get what she's doing. So then, out of one of their limbs comes this smoke, and it goes onto a screen, and it forms into a kind of elaborate circle. And they keep doing this, and the humans keep taking photographs of these, and then they look at the photographs later and try and work it out. And she works out what it is they're trying to say. And everything they say is circular. And she works out why that is, because everything we say is in a line, right? It's linear. And everything they say is circular. And she works out why. It's because their sense of time is different from ours. Our sense of time is linear, past, present, future. We're going one direction. And they don't have that. Their sense of time is completely different. Their sense of time is circular. In other words, they don't experience time going in a direction. Everything happens all at once. There's no past and there's no future. There's just simultaneity. So everything they write is circular, because it doesn't matter, a word is circular, a sentence, a paragraph, a whole book would be a circle, because it doesn't matter where you begin. There's no beginning and no end to it. Yeah. So she's tumbled to this, and she's trying to communicate to them. And then she, as this is happening, no, this doesn't happen in the film actually, but it's based on a short story, and I was so impressed by the film that I dug up the short story and I read the short story by Ted Chiang, and it's called The Story of Your Life, the short story. And in the short story, what happens at a certain point is she's looking at a video of someone else talking to the heteropods, or the tetrapods, whatever they are, heptapods. And this man is trying to explain to them about the human idea of altruism. Yeah. And these heptapods are all engaging in the conversation very animatedly. And she asked the question, she said, well, why are they doing that? Because they know exactly what he's going to say before he said it. Because everything happens all at once for them. So why are they engaging in conversation? And then she starts talking, in the book, she starts talking about speech-act theory. So in speech-act theory, you get speech which is informative, and then you get speech which is performative. Yeah. So what I'm doing now is I'm engaging in informative speech, because I'm telling you stuff that I think probably you don't know. I'm assuming you don't know what I'm saying, otherwise I wouldn't say it. So you're learning stuff, hopefully. But if we were to do a puja afterwards, you wouldn't be learning anything new. How many times have you done a puja already? You know, some of you have done them hundreds, thousands of times. And every time you do one, it's the same words. Same words every time. You don't learn anything. Because a puja is not informative, it's performative. A puja is a performative. It's a performative speech act. So this really caught my imagination. I thought that's really, really important, because when we look at Buddhist texts, we often look at them for information, for the Buddha to tell us how to live. Now, what does he say about meditation? Let's look at what he says there. What does he say about ethics? And we learn this stuff and then we put it into practice afterwards. But there are certain texts that are not informative. They don't tell you anything new. They're performative. And the point is to perform them. And the thing is that when you do a performative act, it's an action. So when you get married, I got married last year, and at the end of the marriage ceremony, it was in Germany, and they do it differently than in England. That you don't say I do, you say ja. You know, so this woman said, and you have to say ja, and I said yes. But it's important that I say that, and everyone's expecting me to say it, and everyone will be really shocked if I said I don't know. You know, or no, I've changed your mind. Everyone will be really shocked. So everyone's just expecting me and Birgit both to say ja. And we did. But it's important that we did it. Yeah? Because by doing that, that's an action. It's like if I say, like when Singamati contacted me a few months ago and said, would you come and do a talk? And I said, yeah, I would. That's an action. Yeah? It's an action which needs to be followed up. Yeah? So by saying yes, I'm actually doing something, I'm acting. So, the reason I'm telling you all this is because I realise that some Buddhist texts are not informative, and we tend to put them aside. Nothing new in here, and I put it aside, it's useless. But it's not the point of the text. The point of the text is not to tell you anything new, but it's to get you into a certain state of mind. It's to get you into this state of mind, the kalla-citta. That's why we do pujas, to get us into the kalla-citta. So, we do the puja, we go through 6 limbs of the puja, and then what happens, entreaty and supplication, now you're supposed to be in the kalla-citta. So when there's the reading, when someone does the reading, you're wide open and you get it, you really take it in. Has that happened to you? Have you ever been at a puja where you get really concentrated and really inspired, and then someone reads really well? It's important to have a good reader at that point. They don't fluff it. Someone reads really well so you can hear it, and it goes right in, doesn't it? In a way that if they just read it to you in the reception area, this is the reading, and you go, oh yeah, that sounds good. But when you get it in the puja, it goes right in. It's because your imagination has been awakened. And I remember being on a 3-month retreat in... we're going to forget about that now. We haven't got time for that now. But I remember being on a 3-month retreat in Guhyaloka. And we were doing pujas in the evenings. And it was funny because I'd start the puja and nothing seemed to be happening. I didn't notice anything. And then at the end of it, there was this silence. And the silence was different at the end than it was at the beginning. It was a different silence. The silence at the beginning of the puja was absence. But the silence at the end of the puja was presence. There was something there that seemed to be there at the beginning. And I'm an audial person rather than the visual person. And I heard it. I can't describe to you what I heard. I could say it was like bird song. But there were no birds because it was like 10 o'clock at night. It was dark. Sometimes you do get birds at night in Guhyaloka. You get nightingales. But no, that wasn't a nightingale. But it was almost like the silence was pregnant with meaning. And it was almost trying to tell me something. It was almost I felt the world was saying, open up, listen. And it was happening. And I would sit there happily for quite a long time afterwards. Nothing did happen, but it was the pregnant of that silence came about because we'd done the puja, and the puja had awakened my imagination. Yeah.